All right, now it is time for the DELU. That's right, the Dispatch Extended Legal Universe. For the first time, together. Sarah Isgur. That's me. That's weird for me to say myself. But who else is going to do my superhero introduction?
So you're already, now that you're Grand Poobah, you're already referring to yourself in the third person.
That's right.
Like
David
Bob Dole.
French, David Latt, and Amy Howe. Welcome, DELU.
It's just like a little too close to Delulu for me.
Okay, but speaking of Delulu, Amy, you just came from the Supreme Court arguments on Monday morning, and normally we might not have even talked about the argument. We certainly wouldn't have needed you to rush home to tell us, but things went a little off the rails.
Yes, they did indeed. And I will say that this was not a case that I was covering for the blog. The wonderful Ronald Mann from Columbia is covering it for the blog. So I really was there just to watch, and it did not disappoint. This was a case involving the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And Ramon Martinez was representing the student in the case. And so pretty much from the get-go, he was talking about how the school district had changed its argument from the brief in opposition because the school district was the respondent in the case. And I'm sitting there and I had a pretty good view of the council table. And I just kept thinking, I can't wait for Lisa Blatt to get up there. And it was spicy, as one of my fellow reporters said on Twitter after the argument, because she took umbrage, I think is a nice way of putting it, with Ramon's characterization of the respondents having changed, the school district having changed its position. And first she said it was an out-of-body experience, which, you know, is Lisa. But then she accused them of lying.
She used the word lying, which in
lying.
law world is a big deal.
That's a big deal.
Justice Gorsuch kind of stopped her and said, "Are you sure you want to use those words?" And she did.
She did, in fact, want to use the words that she used.
So the argument continued for a while, and then Justice Gorsuch said, "I want to come back to that." And basically, to make a long story short, he had been going through her brief, and he sort of read her a series of quotes from her brief. And he basically said, you know, wouldn't a reasonable person like read this as sort of saying that, you know, to make a long story short again, that like you did in fact change your position. And she, you know, in the end said, fine. But I'm really not capturing the moment. You know,
well, that makes some sense, because why we actually are meeting today in our first DELU, we need to figure out a way to pronounce this. DELU. DELU. I don't know. Okay, but anyway, in our first,
we gotta. Which syllable is the emphasis on? Like,
well, God knows David French can't ever get that right.
I prefer just DELU. DELU. There you go.
Okay, we're meeting for the first time with our powers combined, a la what was the environmental group where they each have rings?
I'm just thinking of the Justice League here.
Like, no, come on, David Latt, you're my age.
We used to watch.
It's not the Power. It's the Power, not Power Rangers.
The Wonder Twins?
Captain Environment. Wasn't it Captain Environment? Okay, whatever.
I'm thinking of the Wonder Twins.
Thanks, Wonder Twin powers activate. Yeah.
Oh.
No, like the
Shape of.
The Captain Environment, they each needed their rings of wind, earth, water, and something else to combine in order to create Captain Planet. It was Captain Planet.
Yeah,
that's what it is.
For this.
Okay. Well, they can only make Captain Planet when they're all together and put their rings together. That's the point. Now we're together. We agreed to meet together because we were going to talk about transparency in the courtroom and, in short, whether there should be cameras in the courtroom. So I just want to go around quickly to the question, should there be cameras at the Supreme Court? You only get a one-word answer. We will dive into your fuller answer in a moment. Amy.
Yes.
Latt.
Yes.
French.
No.
Sarah. No! Okay, so representing team cameras, I mean, Amy, it's my bad luck that today happens to be the day we're having this argument, I feel, given that you're now having to come here and describe to me the looks on people's faces.
Exactly. That is exactly right. Because I will say, live audio is certainly better than not having anything at all. And, it's a big improvement from what we had before COVID, when we used to not get the audio until the end of the week. And we still don't get the audio of the opinion announcements, which I will continue to grouse about. But, you don't get the facial expressions. You don't get the body language. You just don't really get the vibe in the room. And I think people would be more likely, certainly, people do listen to the audio when they're really interested in the case. I think people would be more likely to watch it than to listen to it, because if you watch it on C-SPAN, I think they do put up the pictures of the justices, but you can tell who's talking. The Supreme Court, most oral arguments, it's a pretty big courtroom, but most oral arguments, they allocate 50 seats for the public. And so, a lot of the big arguments, sometimes that will, and they've started a lottery. I'm trying to figure out how many seats they actually allocate through the lottery as opposed to standing in line. But, if you're a member of the general public, if you're not a lawyer, you don't know somebody at the Supreme Court, for a big case, like if you're not willing to stand in line for a couple of days, your odds of getting in are pretty slim. And when the Supreme Court is hearing arguments in these big cases, like, birthright citizenship, presidential immunity. Well, Dobbs wasn't a good example because it was COVID, so the courtroom was closed. But affirmative action, like, people deserve to see the Supreme Court in action.
Okay. Amy's arguments largely rest on civic education, which is my weak spot.
I know. That's
so David,
where we
French,
live. Yeah.
You're the one who's going to have to rebut Amy's initial salvo.
Yeah. So I hear all that. Let me just go back to something a listener said. This was 2 or 3 years ago. Said, your podcast has gotten me to listen to Supreme Court arguments, because when I listen to Supreme Court arguments, I hear public discussion the way it should happen. That this is what we're missing in American public life, are people who are engaged in serious, high-minded discussions without going into personal attacks. I mean, with the partial exception of today, apparently. And I was thinking, why is that? Why is that? Well, one of the reasons why, obviously, are the norms of the legal profession itself, which are, there are rules of civility. There are rules of decency, in essence, that come into play. And there are norms of decency and civility. And so part of it is a product of the system, but also part of it, I think, was a product of the fact that this is not happening for viral camera moments. And I think this might sound weird. You would almost be able to persuade me to allow it to happen if the minimum age for clerks was 45 years old. And I'll explain why. I think one of the things that has happened that has so cheapened the congressional experience is that you have this situation where you have people who are wanting, obviously, they're politicians, they want to get their name out there. And then they have these very young staffs who are like, oh, you need to go viral. This is viral. So you've got this older person, maybe they're 65, 70, and they're like, I don't know about this InstaTalk stuff. And then you've got their 26-year-old staff going, sir or ma'am, look at 1 million views. This is incredible. And so you've kind of got this dynamic where you've got a younger cohort sort of egging on an older cohort. And I think it creates too many temptations. So I do not think judges are while I admire many, many judges, I do not think judges are a unique form of human clay. And when you put them up against the temptation of virality, and then you combine it with a younger generation that grew up on virality, I think you're creating the conditions to destroy that very special thing that still exists that would cause an advisory opinions listener to say, I listened to Supreme Court arguments to reassure me about the health of the republic. I think that would start to go away.
David Latt, adding cameras in the courtroom will destroy Republican forms of government.
It's an extinction level event, David Latt. Defend it.
So I just don't think that's the case. And this is partly an empirical question. So let's look at some data. We have had cameras in the court, in the federal appellate courts, in a number of them at least, including the court where I clerk, the Ninth Circuit, for years now. And we haven't really seen these types of problems. I actually am kind of surprised that we haven't really seen viral clips from these arguments, but we generally haven't. So I think that's part of it. I think we just don't have any kind of factual basis for thinking this kind of thing would happen.
Trust.
And then
Signal. Trust
the other thing,
Riverside.
Apologies. I don't know
Signal's
if my internet connection works. I don't know why my internet's acting up today. Okay. So the other thing I would point out is you need to look at the people who would be involved. For better or worse, the Supreme Court bar is an extremely elite and insular world. And so these people are not looking for the clicks. They're not influencers. They don't make money hawking things on Insta or TikTok. Their credibility, their reputation, that's their currency. They want to preserve it. So you're not going to see people getting up there making jury arguments and inherit the wind kind of speeches. That's just not what wins cases. And clients hire them to win cases. So I think A, just based on the empirical evidence from the circuit courts, and B, the incentives for the actual actors in this particular system, I agree with Amy. I just don't think we're going to see these problems. And I think the benefits of transparency and civic education just far outweigh the possible cons. And the last point I'll make is, look, I proposed actually a while ago trying this as a pilot program. If we tried this and it didn't work out, guess what? We can just undo it. But right now, we have no data. We have no information. So let's just try it and see how it goes.
Amy and David Latt, do y'all agree that cameras change the presidency? Or no? Do you think different people run for president because of television cameras?
I can't imagine why anyone would want to run for president, personally. But
I think it changes people's conduct once they're in office, and it changes how we select them. People think of that famous debate with sweaty Nixon, but
it changes how we select them, David Latt. So if you know that your Supreme Court justice is now going to be, to Amy's point, have this civic education aspect where people are going to be watching that Supreme Court justice, and more people, because now people are going to be paying attention to the Supreme Court more than they ever have. It's going to change who presidents select for Supreme Court justices. No more nerds of the Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Barrett variety. We're going to have, quippers, let's call them. People who are good at quips, that I've now made the word quippers.
I just think, we do have that civic education. That to me is really the function of confirmation hearings these days. Like, you don't actually learn that much about the nominee or you don't learn that much about how the nominees are going to vote necessarily. But I feel like there is still, and this is sort of my soapbox about confirmation hearings, is there is still a civic value. People are sort of reminded what the Supreme Court does, what issues are likely to come before it. And, the nominee is on television for a long time. And, they're all good on TV.
Yes, and confirmation hearings are bad for this reason. Right? Like, does anyone think this is a good way to do this?
Is there a better way to do it?
I don't know.
I think there's no way around it. I don't think there's any way around it, but it has become a circus. And that's my point, is these things devolve into circus. And I get what you're saying, David, about the empirical measures, Ninth Circuit, et cetera. But it's very hard to get people to pay attention to circuit courts, period. Even as important as they are. Like, I feel like one of the public services of this podcast is we have introduced to the public circuit court opinions and the importance of circuit court opinions, but it's niche, baby. It is niche. And so it's just a different environment.
Amy.
I think all of these same arguments that were marshaled by the Supreme Court to try and oppose live audio, and none of them have come true. The one problem we have had, they started live audio 5 years ago in May of 2020. The one problem we have had was the toilet flush. And we wouldn't hopefully have that problem with live audio.
Why do you call that a problem? That is
Slate wrote a whole article about it.
You're winning the argument with that. Like, more toilet plushes? Okay, I might tune in.
I mean, it was Roman Martinez's argument, and he was back at the court today.
Well, I would say also these two have a history. It seems that when Blatt v. Martinez is on the card, you definitely want to watch that fight, because they also did the Warhol case, which was also one of the most interesting and entertaining arguments of the past couple of years. So I think I need to look at these sort of calendars and see, like, oh, when are Lisa and Roman mixing it up again?
Yeah.
Also led to one of the most interesting lineups of the court, with Kagan and the Chief in dissent, going on about various works of art and literature, and her and Kagan and Sotomayor's footnotes, like personally attacking each other. Some ipsa dixit being thrown around.
But I will tell you, like, after 5 years of live audio, like, everybody in the courtroom seems to have forgotten that there is live audio. Like, you can see, like, even in the sense of, like, when we get to the end of the attorney's sort of allotted time and they go into the Syrian questioning, like, the chief just kind of looks around. He doesn't always even name the justices as he's asking them if they want to ask any questions. Like, everybody in the courtroom forgets that there is live audio.
Okay, so to summarize, what I've heard from Amy and Lat is civic education. It will help educate people about this branch of government that they don't seem to know much about, and about the Supreme Court, and maybe they'll be able to actually name a Supreme Court justice instead of the numbers now, which are quite abysmal. And two, there's really no downsides, that the downsides are exaggerated or perhaps non-existent. Is that fair? Team, yes? Okay, and Team No is like, yeah, civic education would be good. We acknowledge that there would be some upside, but Team No also feels like the downsides could be really, really large, as we've seen with the cameras being introduced to Congress, for instance, and C-SPAN having the civic education purpose and maybe destroying Congress in the meantime. And certainly, I think changing who runs for the presidency, the sort of Jonah Goldberg transparency, like all things, is only good in moderation. Is that a fair summary of our position, French?
I would say that's fair. And by the way, talking about C-SPAN reminds me of one of the fun moments of teaching undergrads this past year. I was teaching a class on how American politics went insane, and they could not believe that there was a time where there was a C-SPAN camera that was only fixed on the podium, and all these congressmen would come up and deliver stem-winding speeches to empty rooms. And no one had any idea that they were empty rooms. And it was like, wait, what? Nobody panned the camera around? No, this was low budget. It was fixed.
All right. With that, I thus conclude our first meeting of the Delu. Maybe we're going to need a new name. I don't know. Thank you for joining us today. Amy Howe, David Lat, David French, and on this, one of the more exciting oral argument days that's really not about the case, just about the fireworks in the courtroom. Before we go, Amy, and statement against my own position, what can you tell us about the body language, facial expressions? What would we have gotten from a camera that we couldn't get from the live audio?
It's hard to capture, which is why we need cameras. There was just this sort of mix of shock and bemusement, I would say.
I feel like that's what Lisa inspires in general.
Yeah.
Was she wearing the cowboy boots?
No cowboy boots. Just a pair of pumps.
Lisa. The Chief Justice once told, this is Chief Justice Rehnquist, I believe, who once told Ted Cruz, when Ted became Solicitor General of Texas, and Ted asked, is it appropriate to wear cowboy boots, formal ones, snip toe, into the courtroom to present an oral argument? You don't? Okay, so Amy Howe, snip toe cowboy boots are the pointy toed ones. They're considered formal. Ropers are more blunted at the end. Those are your working cowboy boots.
Okay.
Lisa's are snip toe. Most of the cowboy boots you've probably seen are snip toe if you've seen them around DC. So Ted Cruz asked this to Chief Justice Rehnquist, also his former boss, and the Chief Justice supposedly replied, if you're the Texas Solicitor General, I think they're required.
We could have like a Supreme Court fashion.
Yes. No, exactly.
At some point.
I may have to start coming down to DC and with a roving microphone as the advocates enter, or who are you wearing?
Who are you wearing?
See, this is what cameras would do. Bad stuff. All right. Thanks, guys.
Okay.
We'll meet again.
Good to talk to you.